now. Okay, we're now recording. So before I turn things over to Kristin to introduce Yashica, just a few words about how the event will be run. We have 4 parts to the evening. First, Yashica will read briefly from her wonderful memoir coming out as Dalit, which if we were doing this event in person, I would have her sign my copy of. She will then deliver a brief talk on caste in the contemporary US, how caste continues to operate in the US. This will be followed by a conversation between Kristin in the religion department here at Carleton and Yashica, and then finally a moderated Q&A. And so for the Q&A part, you would use the chat function. The chat will only go to the hosts of the event, not to avoid distraction. Chat will not be visible to everybody else. And as you've seen, you can turn your cameras on, but your microphones will be kept off over the course of the event, so as to prevent distractions. When we get to the moderated Q&A, I, as the moderator, will read the questions from the chat to Yashica, and then she will answer them accordingly. So without further ado, here is Kristin to introduce Yashica.
Thank you, Arnab. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see some people whom I recognize from nearby and afar, and other folks I don't yet know, but it's a delight to be with you tonight. Thank you, Arnab, for really organizing this, and Mosaic as well for suggesting that we invite Yashica. I'm Associate Professor of Religion and Coordinator of South Asian Studies at Carleton these days. And I'm just going to give a very brief introduction and let Yashica's work speak for itself when she reads and then talks to us, and then we'll talk with her. Yashica Dutt is a leading anti-caste journalist and the author of Coming Out as a Dalit, a memoir. A graduate of St. Stephen's College, Delhi, she spent a decade covering arts, culture, and fashion in New Delhi before moving to New York, where she graduated from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in 2015. Her journalistic work has been published in the New York Times, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, Hindustan Times, Scroll, The Wire, and HuffPost India, and I may be leaving out several others. She's also the founder of dalitdiscrimination.tumblr.com, a Tumblr blog portal. Coming Out as a Dalit, her first book, has received immense critical acclaim and is currently being taught at several universities across the United States. As she tells us in the book, she spent a lifetime hiding her Dalitness to pass as upper caste until 2016, when she came out as a Dalit in a Facebook note in response to the suicide of Rohit Vemula, a Dalit and a PhD student at the University of Hyderabad. Her book is part journalistic nonfiction, part memoir, and it's a scathing account of how the caste system operates and affects Dalits in today's India. Her work seeks to expose caste as the, quote, invisible arm that turns the gears in nearly every system in India, unquote. Beyond India, however, her voice has been instrumental in understanding the realities of caste as they exist globally and operate within an increasingly prominent Indian diaspora. So without further ado, I want to welcome Yashica Dutt to Carleton College, and thank you so much for being with us. I hope she's, unmuting. That's a good idea.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Hi, everybody. Thanks for that generous introduction, Kristin. I'm really happy to be here, and I really wish we were doing this in person, but like Arnab said in the beginning, it really has allowed me to be a part of this wonderful community that I would have not possibly been able to do because, you know, living in New York and having a full-time job has its challenges. So I'm really excited to be here, and this is going to be a wonderful event, hopefully, because we are going to do a lot of things. I'm, you know, right after this small introduction, I'll launch into a book reading from Coming Out as Dalit, Dalit, followed by a lecture, and then a Q&A with Kristin. So I'm really excited, and without wasting any time, let me just dive in. This is my book that I wrote in 2019. It's only available in South Asia for now, hopefully soon in the US and the rest of the world. The chapter that I'm reading from is based on reservation. A reservation, as a lot of us know, especially if you're South Asian, it's the affirmative action program that has allowed Dalits like myself to be where I am today, and has allowed access to education to so many Dalits back in India. And yet it is also one of the most contested and perhaps the only narrative about Dalits that is discussed in mainstream media. So this chapter, and I'm not going to read the entire one, but I do want to highlight on how damaging this narrative is and how it's really, a constructed myth. Why is it that we just focus on this one angle versus the daily atrocities and indignities that Dalits have to face? Chapter 7, the argument for reservation. Through the 3 years I spent at St. Stephen's, I was worried about people finding out about my caste. Only when the result lists went up on the notice boards and my name was tucked under the SC/ST category, or towards the end of the course, when my classmates began discussing how easy it would be for a reserved category student to get into a good MBA college. I stayed silent through most of these discussions because I didn't know how to tell them why that wasn't true. I wasn't entirely sure myself how reservations worked, but I felt deeply ashamed about grabbing the resources that belonged to those that rightfully deserved them. And that certainly wasn't me. I had internalized the argument that anti-reservationists make when they claim that reservations ruin the chances of deserving upper caste people in college and job market. Of course, I thought, they were right to be upset about that. But beyond these few moments of anxiety, my caste didn't bother me too much in college. That would not have been the case had I attended other Delhi University or DU colleges. In most colleges in DU, the annual student elections, often criticized for being flashy and dramatic, are heavily backed by the student wings of prominent political parties: BJP, Congress, CPIM, JDU, ASU, etc. These elections are often fought along caste lines, with candidates from certain castes being fielded for certain posts. The elections have been criticized for allowing caste, money factors, etc., to rob campus politics of a level playing field. These elections are naturally banned at St. Stephen's, and therefore its students are shielded from the caste-based bullying that's common in several DU colleges during elections and the rest of the school year. Other colleges of Delhi University, like several universities across the country, are steeped in caste discrimination, where Dalit students and faculty alike have to jump through hoops. Their identification as lower caste because of the reservation makes them particularly vulnerable to discrimination and abuse from college authorities. Application forms get lost in the mail, the theses are not approved in time, and scholarships remain stuck in the back offices for months and even years. Not just in Delhi University, Dalit students face institutional bullying in most other state and central universities that are required to follow the reservation policy. At Hyderabad University, Rohit Vemula faced such discrimination. His grant was severely delayed until he ran out of money and was forced to live off the generosity of his friends and well-wishers. Most Dalit students understand the power the university system wields over their education and choose to duck their heads, blend in, and comply. Unlike them, Rohit was an outspoken advocate for social justice and a student activist leader. He not only refused to overlook the systemic discrimination against Dalit students, but also vocally asserted his rights. In fearlessly announcing his Dalit identity and demanding justice for himself, Rohit possibly challenged a fundamental idea that many upper caste professors hold. It's that Dalit students study in Indian colleges and universities on their largesse. So they should be grateful for whatever crumbs they are thrown instead of taunting them by demanding more. In fact, Giri Shankar, an upper caste assistant professor at Kerala's Ernakulam Law College, screamed something along these lines at a 24-year-old Dalit student, Vaishak DS, in December 2016. Vaishak had questioned the professor's criticism against male and female students dancing together at an art fest organized on campus. You belong to the SCST category, and you are studying here and staying in the hostel out of the mercy of the government and people like me, he had reportedly retorted. Vaishak was immediately suspended for verbally abusing his professor, as he, along with most students present, had chanted a derogatory slogan that has circulated among the college students for decades. He only found out that the charges had been made against him. None of the other students were charged when he went to complain about the professor's casteist insult. The notion that constitutional reservation is an unfair government handout to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes who obviously don't need it is absurd. It is a corrective measure that reflects the socialist policies of the nation state and is 1,000 years overdue. This idea of undeserving students didn't spring up in a vacuum. It originated and was widely disseminated during two critical events in modern India's history: the Mandal Commission protests of the 90s and the anti-reservation protests of 2006. The All India Institute of Medical Sciences, AIIMS as we know it in New Delhi, was the main hub for the 2006 protests, and they were widely covered by media channels. I remember watching those broadcasts on television as I saw the action unfold around me in real time in Delhi University. The protests took place in the summer following the release of Rakesh Om Prakash Mehra's Rang De Basanti in late January the same year. In the movie, we see 5 easygoing Delhi University students turn into activists who lead an agitation against government corruption. The storyline is cleverly juxtaposed against the narrative of freedom fighters, played by the same actors from the 1900s. Flashbacks of 5 famous freedom fighters smoothly cuts to the present-day scenes of the same 5 actors: Amir Khan, Soha Ali Khan, Sharman Joshi, Siddharth Narayan, and Kunal Kapoor, conspiring to take down a corrupt minister and attempts to justify their actions as patriotic and in the larger national interest. Several scenes were shot in and around Delhi University, including at St. Stephen's, and many students appeared as extras in the film. The 5 actors had spent part of the year touring various DU colleges, and the pre-release publicity was intense many months before its release. Unsurprisingly, the movie opened to packed cinema halls and became a must-watch for all DU students who felt represented on the screen. Moreover, the India Gate sequence, which had charged shots of the lead actors protesting against a corrupt system and the police brutality against them, resonated widely. In a particular scene, police violence against 60-year-old Wahida Rahman, who plays the mother of R. Madhavan's character, the slain pilot of a crashed MiG-21, had a lasting impact on the audience. The movie was celebrated for reviving the patriotic spirit in the nonchalant early millennials like myself. In this charged atmosphere, when the United Progressive Alliance, or the UPA government, announced its plan to introduce additional reservation for OBCs in April, the movie released in January, Youth for Equality, or YFE, which was a student group based in AIIMS, found it easier to mobilize the usually apathetic students. Cell phones were flooded with text messages urging students to gather at India Gate and to stand up for what's right, that is, opposing reservation. The message was so effective that even I, someone who steered clear of politics, particularly reservation, wondered if I was neglecting my patriotic duty by not attending these protests. Many students who were away for the summer didn't make it to the actual protests, but the message that the quota students have it easy was reinforced forever. Despite limited participation, the protests, which began when YFE called for a nationwide strike in May 2006, had some impact. AIMS was the epicenter, and the college administration openly supported the protesting doctors and students, providing them with tents, pillows, mattresses, and water coolers. The protests also spread to the students of the Indian Institute of Technology, those are the IITs, and the IIMs, and some other medical and engineering colleges. AIMS had no more than a handful of protesters, yet they grabbed national media attention by turning away patients and even denying emergency healthcare in one of the most important hospitals in the country. Meanwhile, the pro-reservation protests, which also took place at the AIMS campus, were brutally shut down by the police, since the administration allegedly did not permit any agitations within 500 meters of its campus. They had relaxed that rule for the mostly upper caste doctors and students who were protesting against reservation, though. Anti-reservationists shouted casteist slogans. They swept the roads and shined shoes to demonstrate that they were, in fact, the new Dalits. Television channels ran the footage almost nonstop. And the television coverage did not call out the protesters on their casteism. And it allowed the viewers, most of whom anyway opposed reservation, to frame a new narrative against it. The pro-reservation protests taking place a few meters away barely received any coverage. After almost a month of coverage in print and TV news, the SC ordered doctors to call off their strike on June 3rd, 2006. So that was a little excerpt from Coming Out as Dalit. And if that's okay, then I'm just going to launch directly into the lecture, but I would need either Arnab or Kristin to help me with the slides.
So the slideshow should be showing for everybody, I believe. So just let me know, Yashica, when you need the slide to be moved.
Thank you. So a big thanks to Carleton College, the Eleanor Zealot Fund, and Mosaic for inviting me to be a part of this wonderfully organized event. Next slide, please. Before I wrote Coming Out as Dalit, I was living in the fear of those around me finding out about my caste. And as a result, I lived for decades hiding from my Dalit identity and avoided engaging with any real issues of caste discrimination. When I decided to write my first book, in which I was going to reveal not only my life's most painful moments, but also examine the historical context of the millennia-old system of inequality and oppression, I was immensely grateful to find the work of Eleanor Zealot, on whose work I relied extensively to build my research and further develop a muscle for understanding caste. So to be here today, speaking to all of you, brings me great joy and pleasure. Now, typically, a day before a talk like this one, I spend my time preparing and outlining which ideas might best fit in a conversation. Next slide, please. Yesterday, I spent my time grappling with this story some of you might have heard of. A prominent Hindu sect, BAPS, which also has close ties to the BJP, the ruling party in India, was raided by the federal agents for bringing over daily wage workers, most of whom were Dalit, under false religious visas and forcing them into construction labor for a temple in exploitive conditions. The surprising fact is that this news wasn't coming out of an Indian state where the exploitation of Dalit workers through punishing long hours and criminally underpaid wages is so normalized that no one bats an eyelid when that happens. This was in Robbinsville, New Jersey, which is home to nearly 400,000 Indian Americans and has one of the largest Indian immigrant populations in the country. According to this New York Times article, which broke the story, The workers were living in trailers hidden from view and forced to work 13 hours a day, performing grueling tasks like lifting large stones, operating cranes and other heavy machinery, building roads and storm sewers, digging ditches, shoveling snow, all for the equivalent of about $450 per month. In addition to all this backbreaking labor, they were barred from speaking to visitors and leaving without accompanied by their overseers, and also had their passports confiscated so they couldn't escape. As we meet today to talk about caste in America, this case, which some are describing as the biggest case of forced labor and trafficking in the United States in the last 25 years, is a great example of how insidiously caste not only survives, but continues to thrive and terrorize Dalits right here in the United States. Next slide, please. Caste in the United States is not new. It has existed since Indians first migrated to this country. In 1916, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the prime architect of the Indian Constitution, famously said that if Hindus migrate to other regions of the earth, Indian caste would become a world problem. With incidents like the temple trafficking of Dalit workers in New Jersey, we are essentially witnessing the same oppressive systems of caste and inequality that Ambedkar had talked about over 100 years ago. But even outside of temples, many of which simply ask Dalits to leave when they enter, even in the United States, caste is quite prominent in this country, especially on the campuses of American universities, which host large populations of Indian students, many of whom carry their caste biases directly from India into the diaspora. While most universities have Indian student bodies or South Asian spaces, most often they also tend to be dominated by the so-called upper castes. It is in these spaces where Dalit students, without any protection from the university system, face extreme discrimination from their dominant caste peers. Next slide, please. Perpetuating bigoted and casteist ideas from the Indian university system, many dominant caste students argue that Dalits don't deserve to be in the spaces of higher education because they lack merit. Lobbed as a veiled reference to reservation, which we just talked about, as the affirmative action policy that allows Dalits to enter public universities and access government jobs in India, students often make openly casteist remarks in the same way that they are normalized back home in India. And the Dalit students among them often have no choice but to hide their identities and face the discrimination in silence, or speak out and face complete ostracization from the influential South Asian alumni who already have taken hold of positions of influence in coveted tech and engineering companies. Take this testimonial, for instance. Manu graduated from CSU Sacramento and revealed to AlJazeera.com that her study group of mostly Indian students would make sure she wasn't Dalit before inviting her to join them. She was forced to hide her caste and erase her identity to avoid being left out, in a very similar way that I had done back in India. Next slide, please. Or the instance of Prem Pariyar from Nepal, who sought asylum in the US to escape horrific caste violence in his home country, only to get embarrassed, bullied, and even harassed by dominant caste students on the CSU East Bay campus he was attending. At that time, given my history as a survivor of caste violence, and also because of the fear as an immigrant under the Trump administration, I didn't feel safe to report, particularly because my university did not recognize caste as a protected category. He said, the active presence of caste and caste discrimination on the campuses in the United States is a direct pipeline to harassment, intimidation, bullying, and exclusion of Dalit employees in the workplace. Next slide, please. Dominant caste workers go on to create powerful alumni networks, which form the bedrock of caste hegemony in Silicon Valley through internal referrals, appraisals, and peer evaluations. Dalit students, professors, and workers suffer in this ecosystem from bullying, shaming, and segregation, says a powerful testimony from Equality Labs, which many of you might know is an Indian American Dalit civil rights organization. And these ideas of how dominant caste students who become dominant caste managers while harboring caste hatred towards Dalits, which then leads to their discrimination in the workplace. These ideas are not abstract concepts either. Next slide, please. As some of us know, in July 2020, California's Department of Fair Employment and Housing regulators sued the multinational tech giant Cisco for discrimination. But unlike the relatively known discriminations of race, gender, sexuality, and disability, this lawsuit was based on the discrimination of caste. A Dalit engineer had alleged that his Brahmin upper caste managers had harassed him and stopped his warranted promotions over the course of a few years, ever since they found out that he was a lower Dalit caste. One of the upper caste perpetrators was in the Indian Institute of Technology at the same time as the Dalit engineer, and discovered that he had availed the affirmative action policy or reservation, and therefore concluded that he might be Dalit. After months of humiliation, lost work opportunities, and blocked pay raises, the Dalit engineer decided to take this matter to court. And his single act of defiant courage opened a whole can of casteist worms that had been breeding for decades in the South Asian dominant spaces in the Silicon Valley. In a story I reported for the New York Times, dozens of Dalit employees went on record to discuss how they had faced almost identical circumstances at the hands of their Indian upper caste seniors in the United States. Many of them could never openly discuss their caste, and among everyone I spoke, not a single person wanted to reveal their identity for the fear of backlash from their upper caste coworkers, which according to one participant could ruin their career. Moreover, in the absence of a law to protect their rights, the lack of a basic understanding of caste as a living, present reality in this country, and given their vulnerability with their work-related visas, on which the entire survival of the US depends on, most of them have no choice but to suffer in silence. A few weeks after the Cisco case, another tech giant, HCL, was also sued by a Dalit employee for a similar wrongful termination by an upper caste superior for his lower caste. Additionally, Equality Labs received complaints from 260 Dalit employees who worked at companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft about incidents of caste-based slurs and jokes, bullying, discriminatory hiring practices, bias in peer reviews, and sexual harassment. Soon after, a coalition of 30 female Dalit engineers reached out to the Washington Post in a statement on the harassment they were facing at tech companies throughout the country. Next slide, please. But it's not just the Silicon Valley where caste-based discrimination is beginning to show its hateful biases. According to a 2018 survey by Equality Labs, more than 67% of the Dalits in the Indian diaspora have admitted to caste-based discrimination in the workplace. And even outside of work, 40% Dalits admitted that they felt unwelcome in places of worship, tracing directly to casteist attitudes back in India, where Dalits continue to be killed for entering Hindu places of worship. A recent story in NY City Lens revealed the terror a Dalit family living in Jackson Heights in Queens experienced when they had a rock thrown in through their window and had achut, which is the Hindi slur for untouchable, scribbled on their car in the early 2000s. The same story also divulged that a Sikh Gurudwara in Woodside, which is another neighborhood in Queens, was subjected to violent attacks over several years, simply for hanging a photo of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in their premises. Next slide. Yet, there is some good news. Sorry, we need to go back to the slide before that. Thank you. Which is that we are finally talking about caste. Instead of brushing horrific caste discrimination aside, like it has always been done, or parroting talking points that ricochet off the same casteist bubble as they have since centuries, caste is finally being addressed for the diabolical and dehumanizing construct that it is. Even in the United States, especially since the lid blew off the Cisco case, there have been active efforts to recognize and understand caste discrimination. In December 2019, Brandeis University became the first in the country to officially prohibit caste discrimination and add caste to its non-discrimination policy. And just last month, in April, which is officially recognized as Dalit History Month, the Cal State Student Association, which is the country's largest four-year public university system representing 23 campuses of the California State University and nearly 500,000 students, they passed a resolution supporting the addition of caste as a protected category against discrimination. And more universities, including Harvard, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Davis, are also looking at issues of caste and discrimination faced by Dalit students on its campuses. Next slide, please. While it still might not be enough to undo the years of caste-based systemic exclusion that so deeply pervades in Indian communities in the United States, it's certainly a start. As allies, it is now up to us to understand how caste endures and operates among us. As folks who are committed to calling out discrimination everywhere, we need to call out the damaging narratives of caste wherever we see them, whether it's on our campuses, our workspaces, and even our homes. Caste has been a buried reality for too long, and now it's time for uncover it and eradicate it. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Sorry. Thank you so much, Yashica. Go ahead, Arnab.
I was just going to say that the next part is the conversation between Kristin and Yashica.
Thank you, Arnab. Thank you so much, Yashica. That was stunning in so many ways, right up to the minute reporting based on yesterday's news and lots of information I wasn't familiar with about student work and university work, both at Brandeis and in California. So thank you for that. I have a wide range of questions, some of which I briefly sort of previewed with you over email. So they're more or less the same, sort of under the same umbrella that I painted in that email. Hard to know where to start because there's so many, you raised so many important sort of news breaking points. But I think I might want to go back to sort of how you started your reading. Reading from your book and speaking about really going back to the very personal, as you spoke about the shame that you struggled with in college, university, as you wrote about feeling often convinced that even though you were an outstanding student, that this was nothing more maybe than dumb luck or lack of competition because of the reservation policies and attitudes about those that made you doubt your own obviously outstanding abilities. And I think this is something you recognize in your own book, that this is a kind of challenge that students of color, perhaps despite their specific caste, may face. You actually cite how Ta-Nehisi Coates in his book, Between the World and Me, writes about the need for Black kids who feel they need to be twice as good, how Black boys feel this and feel they have to work twice as hard. So you had a hard time recognizing your triumphs, which are abundantly clear to many of us here at this point. And I wondered if you could share, this is a very personal question, but how you managed to deal with this. Have you managed to deal with this? Are you still overcoming this sort of low self-esteem that may come from years of discrimination?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and thank you. No, thank you so much, Kristin. I haven't overcome it yet. Even with every invite I get to speak at university events like that, like this one, or, you know, I recently won the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar, which is one of the highest literary awards in the country. I feel that this is dumb luck. I feel that maybe I shouldn't be here. And one of the reasons that I'm able to get over that mindset is because I was extremely fortunate to be in therapy for years, to be able to see this complex system that has existed around me ever since I was born, which there was no escape from, which told me that this is how things are. One of the things that we hear in Indian cultures and Indian societies is that this is how we are, this is who we are. And one of the aspects of this is who we are is casteism is also who we are. Shaming people for being born in a low caste is also who we are. Their inequality and the fact that somebody is superior and somebody has to be inferior so that the power differential always exists is also who Indian societies are. And I really imbibe that. And most people who live in India, who grow up as Dalits, really have a hard time with unlearning that education. Because when you live in an environment which is constantly telling you that you are lower, you are not equal, you don't deserve to be here, even when you make it through a college like St. Stephen's, when you're told that you are just here because of reservation, and you are like, I had a teacher tell me that I was taking some other student's seat because I was in St. Stephen's and because I wasn't excelling at physics like he wanted me to. And he said that I was grabbing some other student's seat. I never realized what that meant, but the shame of my teachers in St. Stephen's telling me that I didn't belong there when I clearly did, without really pointing out the reservation aspect, as they would in perhaps other universities. Stevens is like the perfect example of how urban woke culture operates in India. They will never really point out the causes of why they're telling you what they're telling you, but they will still make you feel inferior and lesser than. And when I really grew up with that mindset that I had to work twice as hard, I had to be completely perfect in order to even exist in the same spaces that are clearly not built for me, that are built to keep me out. And one of the ways that I was able to do that, like I mentioned, is of course therapy. And because I was just extremely lucky. I was extremely lucky to leave India and move to the United States. And I had the foresight to not integrate with the South Asian community here. I made a very difficult decision. It also is a decision that robbed me of my national identity, my cultural identity. I did not know what I would identify as anymore, because I didn't identify or want to identify as South Asian. Because being South Asian meant that I would have to constantly answer for my caste. I would have to constantly lie about my caste, or I would have to constantly hear justifications that I didn't belong there and I didn't have the merit. Or this question would come up whether I had availed reservation in St. Stephen's or not, and whether I deserved to be there. And these questions would be never ending. However, this is just my story. The fact that I was able to access mental health support, and the fact that I left India. But there are other people who are still in those conditions back home, who don't have these opportunities. And what they do have is the work of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. It is, in my opinion, of course, nothing can be equal to actually seeking therapy. But when you read for the first time that here is somebody who is from the same caste as you are, and this person is not thinking of you or addressing of you as an inferior. This person is not talking about compromising your rights. This person is saying, I want equality for you or nothing else. They're not afraid to say that if Hinduism is not benefiting you as people, if this religion is constantly going to label you as inferior, then leave it. And then Ambedkar showed through his work that how there were options that outside of this caste, this bubble that I described, that in India we just inhabit so easily and effortlessly. And which is why if you've noticed, or if there are South Asians or Indians who grew up in India will understand that Ambedkar is really absent from our national narrative. And one of the reasons is that because he directly challenges the caste system. He doesn't say, oh, Dalits, let's just assimilate. Let's be nice. Let's play nice. It's okay. We might hope to achieve the superiority that Brahmins have someday. He says, let's shatter and annihilate the system altogether. And that also, when I read that for the first time, it was like a lightning rod. It was like somebody had opened the curtains in my mind and just made me see the light, because nobody before that has stood up for my absolute equality. I still believed that I had something to overcome or make up for. But when I read Ambedkar, I realized I was an absolute equal. And here was somebody who was not taking no for an answer. So that really helped.
Thank you. I want to follow up a little bit what you just said. So here you are in the US and you're working, I'm sure, incredibly hard. I don't know to what degree living here, you may feel you're working even harder than you would in journalism in India. We may have time for this later, but you do talk about, you raise in an article you wrote about Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, which I hope we have a little time to talk about. You talk about her lack of attention to capitalism, I believe, as a force here that differs, that makes, as she connects caste to race in the US,
right.
She sort of fails to address capitalism in the US as a big difference. But bracketing that for a second, here you are working really hard. And I'm curious, as we think also about self-esteem and recognizing structural forms of discrimination and overcoming low self-esteem and feelings of shame by recognizing these structures that have shaped our inner lives, how, if at all, does your work empower you to, if at all, to move beyond shame, to embrace a sense of power as you work as an activist, really, through your journalism and your memoir writing? Can you speak a little bit about your work and its relation to your sort of freeing yourself, liberating your own self from the shackles of shame?
Sure. I do want to mention here, Kristin, that work for me does not exist in isolation, because the work that I do, the nature of work that I do, is so deeply personal, and I'm so deeply moved by whatever I do write about, that it affects me on a personal level. So maybe it's not the best thing when we talk about work-life balance, but there isn't much separation from my personal life versus what's going on in my work life, because for me, even now, my journalistic projects are what's outside of my day job, which is in advertising, which is work. So I mean, that's what I have to do in order to survive, because like you rightly mentioned, journalism doesn't pay in the United States, and it definitely doesn't pay brown writers from the global South. It might pay writers who are, from Europe. It might pay Indian Americans, but it definitely doesn't pay us, because there is this idea that either we can't speak proper English or we don't have an understanding of journalism, whatever these biases are. So, just to clarify that work is personal, and it always has been ever since I got involved with this in 2016. And, the journey of accepting myself really happened over time. And it was a process. I guess leaving India was a huge aspect. Being in therapy was another aspect. Being exposed to university level education in the US, which, I mean, I have to say, Columbia gave me a really good education to deal with these systems and understand and recognize them. But what really freed me was that Facebook note that I wrote in 2016, which is when I decided, I heard about Rohit Vemula's death, which I briefly mentioned in the reading that I gave. And I read his suicide note, which was his last letter, which was so extremely powerful. And I've talked about this before, where I realized that I'd never read a Dalit person write in English before. And I realized that how that could have been me with just a few different permutations and combinations. And despite all the hardships that Rohit Vemula had to face that I didn't face, he still stood up and spoke for what is right and had to pay a heavy, heavy, heavy price for that. I mean, most upper caste establishment, the best Dalit is a Dalit who's dead. And, that's how he had to go. He was institutionally murdered. But when I read that, I realized that with my Columbia education and with my safe distance from India at that point, maybe I could do something. And I realized that I'm going to start a Tumblr, which still exists. It's called Documents of Dalit Discrimination. And I would collect testimonies of people like myself, people who were either living in hiding their identity. This concept that people hide their identity more or less didn't exist in national consciousness. Of course, people were doing it, but it's not something that we openly talked about in the mainstream narrative before 2016. So I just wanted to create a space. Where are these people who are dealing with this trauma of caste? What's going on with their mental health? How are we dealing with these issues? Because all we heard in national media was reservation, whether it's right or wrong, or politics. Are Dalit politicians more corrupt than everyone else? Those were the only two narratives, or, Dalit violence, of course. I just wanted a space where we could be human beings. And I realized that I can't ask anybody to tell them their story, tell me their story, and tell the world their story unless I told the world my story. And I decided that I was going to write a post where I would declare that I am actually from the Bhangi caste, which is the manual scavenging, the lowest of the low castes among the, it's really among the low there in the caste system. And maybe attempt to unburden the shame that I have been carrying with me all my life. And even when now I'm able to say Bhangi with, in an audience, in a mixed audience, and it still gives me, and I've said this over and over again, it still gives me a little fear in my heart that, I'm saying this word and I'm using that to describe who I am, because there's so much shame associated with that. But then when I declare that I am Bhangi, I'm from a Bhangi caste, and I've been living among all of you castists, pretending to be one of you, and we exist. That was for me one of the most freeing moments. There is definitely, in my life story so far, there's before that moment, there's after that moment. So that was one significant point in time where everything turned for me. And of course, I wasn't instantly free from shame. It took me a long, long time. I'm still dealing with it. But it was at least a very public grieving process that had begun, or a public process of dealing with this shame in an open way. Yeah.
Thank you. That's intensely personal, as your book is. And one of the things that's so amazing about your book to me is the way you weave personal narrative with deep reporting, research, heavy research, and it's the weave is just draws a reader in. I wanted to talk a little bit with you, or ask you a little bit more about your writing, particularly perhaps in relation to something you just said about Rohit's note being, did you say like the first Dalit writing you'd read in English?
Personally, yes.
Okay.
Before that, there has been Dalit writing that exists in English before that. But for me, there was nothing as accessible before Rohit's last note that I'd read in English before. I only thought that Dalits wrote in vernacular languages or Hindi.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because I wondered how you saw, I'm sure you're way more familiar than I am with Dalit autobiographies that have been written, particularly in the 60s or since the 60s, in Indian languages. I was curious if you wanted to say anything about your experience with those, or to what degree you may have had inspiration, but also writers like Sujata Gidla, based in New York, I believe,
yeah.
Ants Among Elephants. written in English, but a very different sort of book. How do you position yourself in relation to other Dalit writers, both either in English and or in vernacular languages? And how do you see your future going?
So this is something I've said before, and in the spirit of complete honesty, I'm happy to say that again. Until I came out as Dalit, I had not read any Dalit writing. I did not even have an association with Ambedkar. Because if you understand, any Dalit writing for me would mean giving away a part of the secret that I held so close to my chest. It would mean that if somebody saw me with a Dalit book, because, it's like how we have in the US. Mostly Black folks read Black writers, mostly women read women writers, women authors. And if you're a Dalit person, then you read Dalit books. And at least back then, that would be a huge giveaway. And that was not a risk I was willing to take or even engage with. I operated from a deeply survival mindset, which is that if I need to survive in the society that is not built for me, and I am hiding my identity, lying about every day practically about who I am, and constructing this other persona, I have to be very careful. And I cannot take any steps that would reveal or divulge that, because the consequences could be grave. It could mean loss of a job, it could mean loss of friends, it could mean loss of my the place where I was living in if they found out I was untouchable Bhangi lower caste person. So it was a very conscious effort on my part to not read any Dalit autobiographies. But speaking of after that, since then, of course, there's been wonderful Dalit writing in English since, I would say since Rohit's death. Unfortunately, he had to leave us for the society to wake up and recognize this moment. But he created this whole movement that is completely different from what happened before 2016. And its wake we've seen now. Sujata Gidla, and I don't know her personally, but I do know that she was working on this book for years and years. And Sujata also comes with from a deeply activist background. She had seen radical activism growing up and was deeply familiar with it. So her story is a completely different Dalit perspective, and it's also from the South, which, those of us who are from India familiar with it know that the North-South divide is a huge cultural divide in terms of how we consume politics or cinema or theater or music. It's completely different. So I was from the North. So our perspectives were, I would say not the opposite, coming from the same space, but manifesting in entirely different ways, So to think about this new wave of Dalit writing, which is direct, which is autobiographical, which is, I would say, not coming from a place of shame or guilt anymore, which is not to say that Dalit writers in the 60s didn't. They also came from a deeply empowered space. Especially, I think it was more radical because the society was not willing to accept them in any which way. Now we at least have certain understanding of these concepts. And speaking of Dalit writing that's coming now is addressing a particular moment. This is a writing for its moment. I think that's the best way for me to frame that. It is a global moment, looking at what's happening in the United States, looking what's happening in Palestine, looking what's happening in Colombia, and it is looking at what's happening in India. So these are all globally interconnected moments, and that's where Dalit writing is sort of coming from.
Thank you so much, Yashica. I have so many more questions, but maybe I should check with Arnab about the time and see if we should open the chat up to questions, or should I ask another?
Well, why don't you ask another, maybe one or two more, and everybody who has questions can start queuing them up now so that we're ready to go with the moderated Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'll continue. And I'll segue, if I might, to Isabel Wilkerson's book that you've written about. You wrote for, I'm looking for my...
Foreign Policy.
Thank you, Foreign Policy, about her book. And I'm curious, or I read the article, so I have some sense of your take on it. Although here it is. And you praise the book. And you And this, I think, attaches to your talking about writing in the moment, that the moment has presented itself in ways that are causing us to have conversations that are maybe also bridging gaps that that continue to exist, but we're trying to make connections between different experiences around the globe. And so you do praise the book. I'll let you talk about it, but you do point out that there are some issues, some problems perhaps in drawing such strict parallels between caste and race. Since we're talking about caste in the US, I thought I had to ask about race, given that this book has come out. You talk about how, while Wilkerson gives us a language uniquely tailored for our times, she does talk about certain definitions of dominant caste, sort of equivalent to white, middle castes, which might be Latinx and Asian, subordinate caste, African American, and indigenous people, and that this is a radical intervention that she makes in these dots. But I did want to invite you, if you don't mind, to talk a little bit about your critique as well, which I think is quite brilliant and important about the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I do want to preface this by saying I have deep respect for Ms. Wilkerson, and her book was really moving and informative for me in ways. And as anybody who's read that book, it's a force of research, of analysis, of writing. And I can only imagine the effort that has gone into producing a book of that scale. However, since the allegory is about caste, I do feel that we have to be mindful of who we are addressing. And my biggest critique of the book is that it equates three systems. It equates racism in the United States as one of the systems of caste that exist across the world. There's Nazi Germany, which also existed across the world and was based on oppression, subjugation of people. I would like to include Israel in that, but that's different. And of course, India. While we have Nazi Germany, and of course, this is a book written for the US. So the bulk of the attention is given to systems of race, the caste system of race, how it exists in the United States, which is only fair because it's by an American author released in America for an American audience and speaking to an American moment in time. However, when you bring other countries and other systems into consideration, it's important to analyze them at their level. She goes into the details of how Nazi Germany operated, but we don't see the details of how caste system in India operates. And it belies, I'm sorry to say, but understanding of caste is very surface level. For example, when she goes to India, one of the few trips that she makes, she looks at shrines and temples in the same way any American, regardless of their race, would look. There's the same exoticization of Hindu spirituality and Hindu culture that we see coming from America that is also present in her perspective. Which is safe to say that while there is an ease with picking up a system to examine it and make an example out of it, there is also an effort that's missing to engage with it in the same level that you are engaging with Nazi Germany or racism in the United States. Now, one of the the responses to my critiques is, well, of course, this is written for the US. Well, then maybe don't call it caste, because ultimately people who are suffering from the caste system continue to suffer, both in India and the United States. And I think it's important to engage with it on the same level, because here we can see the geopolitical divide, the global inequality in terms of which culture deserves more attention versus which culture can be ignored and be a footnote, even though they're the main example that is being used as the metaphor. So that's my biggest critique. And that is, and it's not just limited to Ms. Wilkerson's work, it's limited to all American perspective, how we foreground American ideas and American issues as issues of the world without considering that there are other perspectives which are different and perhaps equally, if not more valuable and worth considering. So that's perhaps my biggest critique of caste.
Okay. How can I follow up by asking, what would you have liked, for example, are there examples that you have in mind that you wish she had sort of dwelt on or lived with a bit longer, or to some degree in the book that she doesn't? The horrors of mass murder, of the police system, of the texture of living in a village, one place over time. Are those the sorts of things you might be thinking about?
I think those are stylistic choices, and I wouldn't want to comment on what one writer chooses to write. But I do want to say that the framing of the caste system came from a point of view that this was a relic of the past, and it had some remnants lingering, but it wasn't examined as an active, present, lived reality for people. And it wasn't deeply examined as a mutated form of oppression that is thriving now. And I really don't blame her for that, because the sources that she accessed, the narrative in India doesn't exist. That narrative that caste is a real reality of our current times doesn't exist in India. So for an American writer to really engage with that concept is difficult, and I do admit that. However, going by the theory that's presented in front of us, that criticism is still valid. And I wish that there was more sort of attention paid to what caste looks like now in India and what it looks like now in the US. Maybe if the book came out next year, it would look very different, because we now have a robust conversation around caste in the US, whether it's the Cisco case or whether it's this, the temple trafficking case that I mentioned earlier. The framing, even the Times framing around it, foregrounds caste very importantly, which wouldn't have happened a couple of years ago. And this is because of the efforts of Dalit voices, both in India and abroad and in the United States, who made that possible. Sorry.
No, please take some chai. I have perhaps one more question, and I'm sure that's all we have time for, if that. Shall I ask it, Arnab? Do you feel comfortable? Okay. Sort of on that note, in terms of how some of the world's biggest news is being reported these days coming out of India with the COVID crisis, I've been surprised, and this may be largely due to my own ignorance, and I'm sure that it is, but I've been surprised at what seems like a lack of attention to caste and caste politics in the wake of the COVID crisis in India. I mean, breaking news today is that the death toll crossed 250,000 in the last 24 hours. And that, I mean, I could go on with the statistics. They're mind-boggling. But interestingly, the Times, in its little bites that it gives, the daily news bites, the bullet points it gave is that Goa, home to picture-perfect beaches that lure tourists each year, is now facing a surge in coronaviruses. So the attention to a tourist attraction. International donors raising millions of dollars to help, but Modi implementing hurdles for overseas organizations. And then the World
and building the Central Vista at the same time, which there is a huge monument. It's being built in honor of the Prime Minister, and the construction hasn't stopped. And the money, where it's coming from, there is no accountability of where the funds of this at least millions of dollars project is coming from. There are no answers. And there's a funding given by the WHO and other international communities. We don't know where that is going. So yes, there is a lot to unpack there. But going back to what you said about caste, there is this attitude that still exists in India, that when there are issues of national importance, we don't have time to talk about caste. Caste can wait. That's always this framing of national emergencies. We saw that at the time of the freedom struggle, when we were hoping to, we were fighting to get decolonized from the British in 1947. There's still idea that existed, okay, caste can wait. The issue is national freedom struggle. So every time an issue like this happens, the attitude is caste can wait. And what we are seeing right now is the same idea, that this is an important of national emergency and you want to divide the nation by talking about caste, when at the same time, the people who are burning these bodies that you're looking at, the photos that you're looking at every day, these burning pyres, people who are burning these bodies are Dalits. There are folks, the people who have passed away, whose own families have refused to touch the dead bodies. They are Dalit cremation workers who have been working day and night without any overtime pay, without any benefits, without even protections. And there is really no conversation about that at all, except, of course, in Dalit circles. Or during the first lockdown wave, when we saw Dalit workers, the sanitation workers who were almost always Dalit, were the ones who were only working. There was a whole lockdown in the country except for them. And they were working without PPEs, without masks, dealing with waste. At that time, we didn't have this idea or understanding that COVID doesn't spread through surfaces. There was still a very grave fear. And there was really nothing done for their protection because Dalit lives have always been disposable. And they continue to be. And like I mentioned, there is this, even now, there is this constant idea that why are you bringing caste into this? Everyone is dying. Well, even though everyone is dying, Dalits are still disproportionately affected by this crisis. For example, with access to vaccines, the Dalit Bahujan population is 25% of the country's population, and they also constitute most of the rural poor. Those are the people who cannot download an app on their phone to register for a vaccine. Those are the people who don't have the money to pay for the vaccine, which in India is not free. So these are the conversations that we're not having, which are really crucial for us to keep having, because caste is always a factor. No matter what happens in India, caste is what's running it at the end of the day.
So we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. I do realize we're officially over time, but Yashica, would you be fine answering a couple more questions?
Sure, yeah.
So let me, okay. So the first question is from Anita Chikatur, who is a faculty member here at Carleton, and she asks, given what you've said about the limitations of Wilkerson's caste, do you think it's helpful at all to draw comparisons between racism and caste discrimination, perhaps as a way to build cross-caste solidarity in the South Asian diaspora in the US, since we all face racism, though to different degrees? Or is it too problematic a comparison that we should avoid such comparisons?
I think that's a great question, and thank you for sending that. I think it is useful to have solidarity between race and caste. When I was coming into this book and when I was researching, I drew most of my inspiration from Black writers, Black feminists, because America's history with racial struggle has been so rich, and so much of the work has already been done by Black folks. They've put in so much of the time, labor, and energy and wisdom in creating this body of understanding that as Dalits, we are all this obviously indebted to that, and there is so much we can learn and offer a solidarity. But is the question coming back to, is caste race or is race caste? That's a slightly more complex question, because the way it manifests is completely different. You cannot look at me and tell me what my caste is. But if it's a South Asian person in the room, they can speak to me for 5 minutes and figure out what my caste is. So the visibility versus the invisibility of one as compared to the other, race being more or less completely visible and caste being more or less completely invisible, I think those are important factors to consider. And while it might not be the most perfect framework, I do think there is so much relevance into building solidarity with, especially with Black folks, especially between Dalits and Black people in the United States, which already exists, which has existed since the time of Ambedkar, which has existed throughout 90s and exists even today. Like, we know that Professor Cornel West is a huge supporter, and he is a fierce supporter of Dalit rights. and speaks against Dalit oppression anywhere, whether it's in India or the US. So there is a case for solidarity, which is extremely strong and relevant. But whether caste is race, that's something that needs, I think, more engagement and examination at this point.
One more question from Mia Tanzin Neng. She asks about the connection between religion and caste, since religious beliefs are fundamentally backing up the caste system. How do we need to change these beliefs to stop discrimination? How do we separate religion, presumably Hinduism, from the caste system? Is that possible, do you think, or is Ambedkar's solution, the annihilation of caste, more
throwing me to the dogs, Arnab, but I'll answer this question. This is one of the most fundamental complex questions that has been around as far as caste discourse has been around. Hinduism, does it have merits versus does it not? The way I choose to look at it is that people who are born as a part of Hinduism, that is their cultural reality. That is those are the festivals we celebrated, those are the clothes we wore, those are the sort of cultural values that we imbibed. Even though when we were Dalits, we still considered, I grew up believing in Hinduism, or at least I grew up as a Hindu. Like I'm an atheist now and I don't believe in any religion. But as far as I'm personally concerned, and I will not give any advice to anybody to what they should do as far as their religion is concerned, because I feel that faith and spirituality are deeply personal questions. And I don't think anybody should be in a position to dictate who one should worship and what one should believe in. But I do feel that Hinduism as a religion is inherently telling you that Dalits are inferior and Brahmins are superior. The caste system is the main tenet of this religion. Hinduism is not really much without the Chaturvarna, which is the 4 castes. And those castes are never equal. Those castes are never on an equal level field. They're always Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, and then untouchables. So how you want to navigate as an individual while believing in that system and still believing that you are not inferior to a Brahmin is a personal choice. For me, that choice came way before I accepted my Dalit identity. I just have been a spiritualist or an atheist since my early 20s. I did not find much use for religion back then even, but I do know that it means a lot to a lot of people. For my mother, for example, she is a practicing Hindu and she draws a lot of faith from these spiritual practices. Now, if I go and tell her, don't practice this religion because this thinks of you as an inferior, she's probably not going to listen to me because she's also somebody who's in her 60s. She's a person of her time, and these ideas mean differently to her than they do to me. But in theory, I feel Ambedkar's solution is the solution. Hinduism does not offer Dalits equality. And if we want equality, we have to search for solutions outside of that or navigate it for ourselves of how that can work.
If I can just ask one last question before we bring this to a close. I'm sort of curious about your thoughts from an activism standpoint, especially given the challenges of raising consciousness among the so-called upper castes in India and in the Indian diaspora, about nomenclature a little bit. The term Dalit is now in fairly wide usage. And in your, while you were speaking, you put quotes around upper caste, right? And so I'm curious about how you see a sort of reclaiming or challenging of terminology, the use of savarna rather than upper caste to sort of implicate, and not, because the usual way in which a lot of people in India think that it's about Brahmins and untouchables, right, as opposed to the entire sort of savarna system. So do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's something that I paid a lot of attention to when I was writing my book and I first started writing, was that who are we calling upper versus who are we calling lower? The fact is that upper caste versus lower caste as general terms still hold a lot of meaning. They mean something to a lot of people. People understand easily when I say upper caste what I'm talking about. In the same way, a new word like savarna might not resonate. So the challenge for me was to take that word and take the power away from it. And the way we can take power away from that word, in my opinion, is to show every time I write that word is to put it under quotes, to show that these are ultimately false binaries. This power differential is, while it has manifestations in real life, it's created out of nothing. It's inherently a fake system. So, which is why I decided to put upper and lower in quotes, so people can understand that these are really not real ideas, though we have come to culturally accept them. People can, of course, use savarna. I use the word, avarn and savarn. I use these terms myself. But it's also important to keep in mind that, Indian culture and society is not just existent in academia and Twitter. It lives on the streets, it lives on the roads, it lives in our neighborhoods and colonies. And to go and tell people that stop saying upper caste and start saying savarn, people might not take to that idea that easily. But what they will understand is this word with under quotes is challenging something that they already believe in. So I think for me, it was an easier choice to do that. But I do feel that there is a lot in reclaiming the power back in words. Instead of, a lot of people say, why are you even using the word Dalit when it means somebody who has been oppressed? The reason I'm using the word Dalit, the reason I'm using the word Bhangi is, by me not saying those words doesn't change the reality in how other people perceive me. People will still look at me as Dalit, but if I say it before they do, I reclaim my power. I unburden the shame myself. I reveal the secret before anybody can embarrass me or humiliate me for it. And that's my point of view, that, it's important to take power away from these words, and important for people to ruminate and understand why words have the meaning that they do. For example, and not to go into too much detail, but just last week, an actress she's a popular television actress, and she used the word bhangi very casually. And she said, oh, I need to apply my lipstick well, otherwise I look like a bhangi. And that created a huge controversy in India, which is still ongoing, where people were like, well, how can you call us bhangi? And the point is, when you use bhangi in a derogatory way, this will always be that word. But when I say I am bhangi, I'm taking her power away to insult me with it. And that's where I come on from this issue.
So maybe one last question from Tanushree, who asks, says, about growing up in Bombay. In her school, the only thing she was taught about caste was the four castes in a history class. So how do we battle in India the invisibility of caste injustice in the education system?
That's a great question, because as we know, the government has been changing the syllabus to make it look less secular, more fundamentalist, more Hindu, less encompassing of all other religions. So that is an ongoing struggle. But I think as people who are invested in being anti-caste, we need to introduce ideas that caste, first of all, we need to introduce the concept that caste exists. It's only now, several years later, that people are beginning to understand that caste is a part of our society. Before that, the invisibility and the erasure had worked so well that people didn't even believe that caste was still a part. They said, oh, I just thought it was something that happened in rural India, but not in urban spaces. So what's important for us to do is to make the invisible visible, to sort of remove the erasure and highlight how caste is controlling everything, which might involve talking about our own caste locations. It might involve talking to our own families and loved ones. It might involve analyzing everything around us from the context of caste, which it already exists. It's just that it is embedded under so many layers that we just don't see it for what it is. So the work, I think, starts with us and starts at home. But honestly, there is not much we can do in changing the textbooks. That's something only, the government's going to do what the government's going to do. We can call them out, But what we can do is introduce anti-caste literature to our children, to our students, and make them more aware of how caste is a reality.
Well, I think we need to thank Yashica now for giving us so much of your time and for this wonderful set of conversations. And thank you to all of you as well who have stuck around. You are now actually should be unable to unmute yourself. So I would invite you all to unmute yourselves and then in about a second or so, join me in giving Yashica a big round of applause.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Yashica.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Lovely
wonderful.
being here. Thank you. Great being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming.